What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, the number one source on the interwebs for the best thinkers in the academies, be they scholars of religion, philosophy, science, all sorts of good stuff that are addressing the big questions of faith. And we want to bring them to you so that you can think through, wrestle with it, and, and brew your own response. So this episode is going to be a blast. Why? Because Wilson Dickinson is on the podcast. And we're going to be talking about faith after a neoliberal compliant church. What does faith look like if we actually imagine the community as a place of life, of possibilities, of resistance to an order that is built on extraction and exploitation of the poor and the planet? So that's an important topic. Wilson is the director of the Dmin program at Lexington Theological Seminary, the sponsor for this episode. And so, I kind of think it works out that I get to interview a student of Jack Caputo, a radical theologian who's also figuring out what that looks like in confessional communities. And he happens to work at the school that was sponsoring this episode. Lexington Theological Seminary is got a number of different degrees, but we talk quite a bit about the Dmin one since he is part of organizing it. They also have an MDiv, an MTS, MPS, that kind of thing. You can check them out at lextheo.edu, lextheo.edu. And if you do, holler at Wilson. You're going to like him after the end of this episode. Also, before we jump in, I want to remind everyone of two things. First, we're getting close to the beginning of the Probing Process and Reality group, an online pop-up community of learning. The one and only John Cobb, who turned 95 years old this past week, is joining me to walk you through Alfred North Whitehead, the OG process philosopher. We're going to be walking through his masterful text, the masterpiece that is Process and Reality. It's notoriously one of the hardest texts to read. And so a lot of people start it or find an interest in it and they go, no, I'm not going to go there. Well, what if the greatest living interpreter of Alfred North Whitehead was going to help you out? And that it's happening. I cannot exaggerate how excited I am for this. And I would love to make it the single largest seminar on Process and Reality. Alfred North Whitehead, a thinker and a text that has influenced me in ways no other philosopher has, with my favorite theologian of all time, John Cobb. John Cobb, best theologian of all time. He also wrote the first eco-philosophy. He has published in economics. He's been published in biology. He is one of the greatest thinkers, one of the kindest humans, and he's wonderfully smart and gifted at communicating process philosophy. So you should go to processandreality.com and sign up. It's a pay what you can class. So that means you can pay $1 million or $0 or anywhere in between. I would prefer something in between, but it's going to be amazing. And I'm so pumped. So processandreality.com, join us, and you will be able to interact, be able to get the wisdom of John Cobb and read one of the most powerful and inspiring and influential philosophical texts of the 20th century, Process and Reality by Alfred North Whitehead. Oh, yeah. And before we jump in the episode, I want to give shout outs to some of the Homebrewed Christianity deacons and elders that are up in. They went to homebrewedcommunity.com and they said, look, Trip, I love the podcast. I do. And this is the thing. I've been listening for a while and I want to support it. And I said, thank you. People like, let's see, Kay Reeves, Joan Sigmund, Paul Mullen, Eldon Price, Peter, Robert, Hogan. Hogan. Okay. When I got the message that Hogan had started supporting the podcast, and I was like, his name's Hogan. Do you realize how cool you have to have the name Hogan? Yeah. And he's been listening since 2014. And now he's part of the diaconate. You know what I mean? If you go to Homebrewed Community, you can join it. You'll get in the private Facebook group. And here's the coolest part about it. There is a private podcast feed for the Homebrewed Community members, and they get special, exciting little treats sent their way. Yeah. So check it out, homebrewedcommunity.com. Thank you for all of your members. And if you happen to be, on the edge, the anxious bench, you could say, like in the old time revivals where they put you down front when they think you're close to converting, then here's the best reason right now. Right. I mean, other than you just want to help bring high quality intellectual engagement to the people across the world via the interweb. Apart from that, when you're taking the Process and Reality class, all the content gets put into the private podcast feed for the members. So you don't even have to download anything. You don't have to go anywhere. It's sitting right there. And on top of that, guess what's going to be popping in that feed this week? A very special lecture. Yeah. A homebrewed seminar is coming right in there, and it's on panpsychism. It's been a part of my research project right now at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm doing an introduction to panpsychism, how it reemerged in science, in philosophy, and what are the different theological questions that come up with it. So if you want to get that, the slides and everything with the lecture and all that kind of stuff, then maybe you should be an elder in the Homebrewed Community and get on that. Oh yeah. Now, after I've said all that, I hope you enjoy this special episode. Wilson Dickinson, sponsored by Lexington Theological Seminary, where he is indeed the program coordinator for the Doctor of Ministry degree. Enjoy. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and Wilson Dickinson is on the podcast, and he is on staff at Lexington Theological Seminary, who is the sponsor of this episode, conveniently. So maybe before we jump in to your newest book, The Green Good News, and then your work before that, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what your position is at the school and your favorite thing about working there.
Yeah. Hey, Tripp, it's great to be here. I work at Lexington Theological Seminary, which is a seminary that's from my denomination, in the place that I'm born. But now with the seminary itself is almost entirely online. Mm-hmm. And so I teach theology for the master's programs, and then also I'm the director for the Doctor of Ministry and continuing education programs. And so our Doctor of Ministry is probably my favorite part of it. But I came to online education pretty as a skeptic, I guess. But there's the way that we do online education is that it's really it's kind of place-based learning, right? Mm-hmm. So instead of the seminary experience that I had, where I went somewhere else and did have kind of a mountaintop experience, but then I came down and I had to do a whole lot of thinking about how do I translate what just happened there into what I'm doing somewhere else. At LTS, the congregation and the place where someone already is their laboratory. And so that kind of bridge work is always being done. And that's kind of the focus of the classroom, is thinking about ministry, thinking about faith, thinking about the tradition, constantly interacting with everyday life and with the kind of the place where you have roots. Mm-hmm. And the Doctor of Ministry program, it lends itself to that naturally, because every Doctor of Ministry program is with, mid-career professionals, I guess pastors, I should say. And our program is for ministers in all different walks of church life and ministry. And our focus is on cultural analysis, cultural hermeneutics, interpreting your culture, interpreting your context, and then using that kind of work to then make a difference, right? So mm-hmm. It's cultural analysis and then community organizing are the two parts that we wed together for transformative ministry.
Oh, cool. Well, I definitely know there's tons of innovative stuff happening and figuring out what the new shape of theological education is going to be with all the transitions that are taking place. Yep. And that's not just even in theological education. I'm at the University of Edinburgh, and the get-togethers that are figuring out all the different ways they do online education and what counts and how you assess things, and then how you value people's previous experiences towards learning goals. And it's definitely a time for transition. So who knows? Who knows what's going to happen? I bet the only thing theological education's confident of is that 20 years from now, it's going to look so different than it currently does that it's probably best to be trying out a whole number of different formats. The other thing I was thinking of, and I don't know if it's been a while since this came up on the podcast, but maybe you could say a bit about what someone gets out of doing a Dmin. And, for those of you that are not ministers and may not consider this, feel free to hit skip for a few minutes, because we're going to talk about radical theology and ecology and things. But I made an ebook once just because I get asked these questions all the time, and I haven't updated it, so I don't tell anyone now. But what is the purpose, and who is the ideal person for thinking about doing a Dmin?
So I like to start talking about Dmins, thinking about it as actually a service to the church and the kingdom, right? So it's holy time that's set apart, which is really like any study is kind of like that. And so it's when a pastor, a minister, and an organ, and a chaplain, any kind of ministry takes some time out of their lives to more deeply reflect on what it is going on in their context, what it is they're doing in their ministry, so as to kind of reconfigure things and to recenter things. So I think it's because we live in this incredibly busy culture in which, we get so ensconced in our institutions, in our jobs, and in which the kind of cultural values of neoliberalism, values of efficiency, productivity, constrain even our imagination. So the Dmin is in a lot of ways a space in which reflective practitioners collaboratively reflect on their context so as to figure out how to intervene in the name of justice and peace. Now, individually, it's also a kind of a usually a time mid-career where somebody is wanting to kind of take a step back and get some new tools and think about how they can reinvigorate and transform where they are.
Mm-hmm. I've taught a couple Dmin intensives at other schools, and I find I end up learning tons from people because they are, representing the wisdom of having been with different communities in different places. And especially for those of us that think philosophical theology is about as much fun as it gets, it's easy for those for philosophical theology to only be on the ground conceptually, right? Like in your head, you like the idea of the transformation of the material order towards well-being and wholeness. It's just you don't know about having friends without graduate degrees or figuring out how to say things in a worship service every week because you would just cross your fingers and feel uncomfortable. And so when you're in the Dmin classroom, I've always found you find out like what ideas are actually helpful at shaping people's imaginations. You find out really cool things that one person in the class just assumes every minister does that you've never heard of before. And like tricks to remember people's names, all like real practical things. And one of them told me real early on, he said, I would make a list anytime I saw someone doing something, like a sign of service they didn't get, lauded. And I have a list and I just kept notes in my bag. So whenever I was stuck in traffic waiting for the doctor, I would write short notes and I'll write, 200-300 in a year. And you want to know if that minister, did she ever have trouble getting volunteers? Absolutely not. And it's not because the humans are different. It's because she cultivated a habit of seeing service and then calling it out with a handwritten note, which people rarely get. And I'm like, that is such a practical thing, right? But the theology behind it, like any decent human's just going to be like, Yes. So anyway, I loved the process of Dmin and, getting high quality new material when you hang out with Dmin students.
It really is one of the most, I guess it's one of the most rewarding educational contexts I've been in as, director, professor, student, and kind of being with people who really are kind of committed to their context and who love their place. And it really is, I guess there's all these different pieces to the social change pie. And it helps me see the way that different things fit together, right? To where I think scholarship in a Dmin program, is playing a certain kind of role in social change, right? So it's like, so this one, social change theorist, Paul Light, likes to say, there's like these four agents, that drive, social breakthroughs. There's social entrepreneurs, social activists, social caretakers, and then there's social explorers, right? And so I think in a Dmin program, you can see how those different pieces fit together. So like oftentimes the professors are social explorers. They're people who are trying to look forward, trying to ask more difficult questions, who are spending their time kind of looking back, standing back and looking. But they're doing that in collaboration with people who are, taking care of institutions, who are in the weeds. And I think that there's something really special that happens when all those different pieces of social change are talking to each other instead of being exasperated with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's awesome. So, so if anyone's interested in it, they should reach out to you.
That's right.
Oh, I just want to, you got to make sure you remind people these things. The social entrepreneur part of you, always be selling. That's I really kind of hate that language of social entrepreneur. Can we have like social craftspeople or social artists there is so much stuff that sneaks in the back door with entrepreneur. Oh yeah. Look, I'm passing on a joke because I'd have to edit it out of the podcast. So I just feel like really mature right now. So I'm interested in your own story. So you said, you're working in a seminary connected to your denomination and such that you grew up in. So as someone who is a radical theologian and connecting to the confessional church, there's bound to have been a rocky back and forth, yet somewhat intoxicating relationship with the church. So how would you describe, ending up where you are now?
Yeah, well, so my connection with the church is complicated, and that is, but it's also lifelong, and there is a sense in which my kind of radical roots, I think, are rooted in the tradition that I come from. I've actually really been appreciating the work of Gary Dorrien lately to help me begin to see these strands, right? To see where kind of these radical and liberation roots are rooted in a social gospel tradition, which was kind of the left wing of liberal Protestantism. And so that's the church that I come from is a deeply, liberal Protestant church. I grew up in the Bible Belt. My community was Christian Church Disciples of Christ. But while there is this kind of left wing to that tradition that is concerned about economic democracy, that is concerned about racism, sexism, classism, that does have a vision of the beloved community and the kingdom of God that I would say is deeply radical. The church that I grew up in was not terribly radical. A lot of the story of the other part of the story of mainline Christianity in the United States, 20th century, is really accommodating the status quo. And so, there is a sense in which my upbringing, my love for the church, has shaped me in certain ways in peace and justice and thinking differently. But there's also a lot of ways in which kind of the deepening of my theological education and engaging theology as not just a set of theories, but as a practice and a set of liberative practices has in some ways put a wedge between me and a lot of the communities I'm a part of, and has created a lot of tense relationships. Mm-hmm. But one thing that is kind of happening is that status quo church it's not even healthy on its own metrics anymore. But there is something that's emerging in churches and in new ways of being church that I think are actually more resonant with that radical left wing. And that's where I'm more and more finding my home in the church.
Mm-hmm. And I think, connected to that is this idea among a lot of mainline Protestants that, if they compare themselves to Jerry Falwell Jr., then they're like, man, look at this. I mean, we're basically Amos, but, without that awareness that you were talking about, that mainline Protestantism was the chaplain to empire in American heyday. Exactly. And that doesn't mean that there's not resources. It doesn't mean that it wasn't, advocating, evolutionary structural type changes to capitalism at the turn of the century, like, labor laws and stuff like that. The church has had its, connection to that movement. But, what both of your books, kind of get at is this calling into question that initial deal. Like, is the church being faithful if it figures out how to fine tune us to be good citizens and family members and workers in the empire of America? Like, is that what we call doing a good job? And if it is, I think mainline Protestantism knows how to do that, right? You care for civic society more. You'll volunteer, you'll give, you vote, you organize, you do those type of things. And one of the things I found helpful, the image you used, was that we're at the crossroads of Earth and Empire. And it's, if we frame that, and maybe you can spell it out, but I feel like framing the question of the moment, on one where we don't assume the big global structures are final and ideal, then we start to challenge ourselves. Like, are we really being as faithful as we thought? Are we really taking seriously the message of the kingdom of God and that type of thing?
Yeah, there was a time where I thought it was exactly like you said, where it was radical, just to not be a fundamentalist. And I thought that was kind of the fault line of radicalism, right? So it's pushing back against the big authoritarian God. And now I think that the fault lines of radicalism are between, neoliberal empire and new forms of just collectivism. That really changes, even the kind of theological landscape and the kinds of questions that we're having, or that we face and that we struggle with. And so that crossroads between Earth and Empire, I think, is where, and this, I think, is where a lot of theology has moved, but not where a lot of the communities I'm a part of, those aren't the debates they seem to want to be having. And part of that's because that changes it from being that the problem is external and the problem is chaos. Instead, the problem is internal. It's not, or it's something we're all caught up in, right? It's not our faults, but we're all caught up in this unjust structure.
Oh yeah. Like, one of the things that I think is real helpful, and it comes out of family systems theory, is the problem with the identified patient, right? Like, when you get to see a dysfunctional family, the most tempting thing to do if you're a member of it is to figure out who the problem is, so you can point at the problem. Because when you identify the problem, then you're like, okay, he's the most screwed up one. He needs a therapist, right? And whoever is the one that's, acting out the most or contributing to the ugliness the most at a given moment, they're not the problem. It's actually the dynamics and relationships that are there. And if we're wanting to move towards health, if we're wanting to try to address, a lot of the challenges, then you need to look at the whole network of relationships, not find a problem so you can externalize it and make it out there. And I think that it's really tempting for the church today to pick neoliberal compliant justice issues, say that's the problem, then put up their pride flag or whatever, and feel like they are outdoing everybody. When so many of the commodification of justice is such that we meaning the system, would like to give you the opportunity to demonstrate your progressive values and do something to make a difference by figuring out new ways to include everyone in the giant system that we're going to keep unquestioned. Right? Like, and so I think that that image of the crossroads of Earth and Empire, it sounds like stated as strong, maybe hyperbolic, and yet until the church even considers the question, it doesn't have the possibility of faithfulness, right? Like unless you take unless you get the diagnosis right, you're not going to move towards healing and wholeness.
Well, and it's been so transformative for me to be able to see some of those dynamics in the scriptures too. Mm-hmm. And I've been reading, somehow this is the first time in my life I've been reading Walter Rauschenbusch, because I used to think social gospel was different than it is. But
Walter Rauschenbusch, he's like a patron saint for Baptists. Like we only if you are a Baptist in America and you're not a fundamentalist, you kind of are like, we got Walter Rauschenbusch, Martin Luther King Jr., Bill Moyers, Jimmy Carter. Like you don't have a whole lot to go on, but Rauschenbusch, you're like social principles of Jesus.
Well, and so he has that nice line where he opens, a social crisis and says, like, the scholars who have been reading the Bible, it's like a botanist who goes out into the woods and just can't see the birds. Right? That's just not what they're trained to look for. And good liberal Protestant that I was not trained to see the systems in the Bible. And I was not trained to see the imperial backdrop. And once I saw that, it all changed, right? So instead of it's just kind of individuals making choices, there are all these systems. And you can see that Jesus is doing his work on the systems in between relationships. And in fact, the kind of work that's happening around Jesus isn't always just about Jesus. It's about what that, as Rita Nakashima Brock says, what that kind of Christa community. It's kind of a clunky phrase, but right. But that what can happen in that relational space, the kind of power that moves in there. Once you can see that imperial backdrop, see that system, then you can begin to see relationships, and then you can also begin to see how different forms of change are possible.
Mm-hmm. And maybe I think it'd be helpful to give an example out of scripture, because I remember the first time it happened to me was the Zacchaeus story, and I was working on I was exegeting it, and I don't remember even who had it as an offhand comment, but in the commentary it said Jericho is where Herod's summer palace was. And, it goes into the details of what they found there. And so you're sitting there, and all of a sudden the fact that Zacchaeus is the chief tax collector in a town that's horribly poor and probably built a palace that looks like a Roman palace for Herod to entertain. Like maybe Jesus was doing something other than just finding the short guy who needed to share. Like there was more going on. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, what if, he's Jewish and he's in a system that's an imperial system. And yet, if you were asked, do you want to compromise your integrity, but no, your kids eat? What parent's going to say no? So maybe Zacchaeus literally felt trapped. You could say that he was like at the crossroads, of covenant and empire. So he wants to go climb up a tree, and maybe there's like, right, a vision of a different type of Israel and such. And anyway, so it was like all of a sudden the whole text became different. And I had learned to read it with the wag the finger, Zacchaeus, you calm down. It's like, I know you've been a bad boy, but you're going to share. And
so there's that line in that story where, salvation has come to this house on this day. Right. And so there's that sense of covenant right there. Right. So if it's just this individual and you think, okay, well, now he's saved, but instead it's that Zacchaeus, who is a middle manager of empire, comes to see the not just the fault of his ways, but through the table fellowship with Jesus, through seeing this alternative form of community, he makes reparations, he transforms his economic life, and he becomes an agent of the kingdom, right? And so then salvation is not for, Zacchaeus' precious soul. It's actually for what happens in that community, what's happening in this kind of collective power that's being formed. It's the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you think of that dynamism and such, like what in the exercises in New Creation text, you start with Paul, and I think a lot of people who are militantly neoliberal compliant gospel proclaimers love Paul. They're like, he has a road, it's Roman, and it's very simple. And that's not the one you uncover in the text. So maybe you can help those of us who just stopped reading him and just read more Gospel of Luke rehabilitate.
Well, I'll do what I can for Paul. I actually when I was working on this book, I was kind of outlining it, and very kind of I was outlining it for my doctor father, Jack Caputo, and I was kind of laying it out, hoping I would get the approval of my academic father, and he's listened very patiently, as he always does, and at the end he goes, "If you knew Paul, don't you think you'd think he was a jackass?" That was his entire response to the book. And my hope, though, is that after someone reads the book, they don't feel the same way, because I feel like I've been reading Paul and underlining different things than everybody else, or underlining different things than I used to from the kind of inherited reading I got. And in that book, that's one of the reasons why I shift to 1 Corinthians, just to kind of get into a different space. And the preoccupations in 1 Corinthians bring out Paul's deep pastoral care and bring out Paul's kind of real sense of love in alternative community. But it's also foregrounded, in those first couple of chapters with this tension between the wisdom of the world and the way of the cross. And so the way that letter just kind of smacks us in the face, maybe lovingly caresses us and tells us repeatedly, this is a new Paul, tells us repeatedly that the wisdom of the world, what's getting in the way of our kind of living into our full creaturehood, and what's the greatest obstacle for the Christian community are the gentlemen, right? The people who are rich and powerful, and they're kind of educators and middle managers that sow that social fabric. And so Paul sets up against that the cross of Jesus, and sets up against that the path of the cross, which is lived out in these kind of alternative communities that he's setting up.
Mm-hmm. And when you are thinking about re-engaging the tradition, where the question of the Earth and Empire is a new one, right? Like the planet was never looking at Homo sapiens until recently, going, "Come on, I thought we were friends," and now we've got multiple ways we can just end life as we know it on this planet, which begs this question where what used to take a chart and some Daniel 7 with Revelation 13 thrown in to come up with it and sound like a sci-fi apocalypse. Now we're making it all on our own. And so I think that this kind of, after nuclear weapons, environmental crisis, this type of thing, the idea that a tradition that has never asked that question being the resource is, it's not immediately obvious that it should be. And so when you're like in that book, you also end up dealing with Augustine and moving through to the rethinking particular practices that are appropriating, right, the concept of new creation and eschatology in the New Testament, but doing so facing our contemporary setting. Can you kind of I don't know, like how would you want to invite people to think about the eschatological vision of the New Testament as a resource for, I don't know, sobriety about the present and kind of collective action?
Well, good liberal Protestant that I was raised as, I'm going to come back to the eschatology. I actually think that there is the situation that we face with the ecological crisis is certainly unique and unprecedented. But I think that there are strong threads and connections that we can make, especially if we come to understand that what we face with climate change is rooted in economies of extraction and exploitation. And those economies of extraction and exploitation have long histories and also have spoiled their ecosystems to the point of civilizational collapse in the past as well. And so one of the points of connection that there is between Hebrew Bible, New Testament, and then even throughout the Christian tradition is that empire has a way of making a big mess. And has a way, and so that has a way of making a mess with wars and with denuding forests and just kind of destroying the habitat in general. And it also has a way of making a mess with the way that its economic mechanisms work. Right. So even in like the old kind of agricultural manuals that exist, there's all kinds of advice about what happens after somebody's spoiled the land. And especially what happens after somebody has spoiled the land when they're basically a plantation owner and they've just been running it too hard. And they've been running it in ways that are unsustainable. They've been raising stuff out to the borders. They've caused all this soil erosion. And, that dynamic comes up, several times in Old Testament. It's in the backdrop of Jesus' parables that these plantation owners, this kind of consolidation of land and wealth to plantation owners ends up destroying the earth, or destroying, kind of ruining the land, which in turn has all these social effects. Mm-hmm. So I think that there actually is a deep resonance with the ways that empire breaks those relationships between neighbor, God, and the land. So we have a lot to learn in kind of social and pragmatic terms, mm-hmm. But also eschatologically, there are all kinds of visions of the world in its fullness that I think should be animating for us. Instead of thinking of the end times as being snatched up out of the earth, right? The vision is God coming down and the earth being redeemed. Right, everyone being around the messianic table, or everyone having a place in the holy city. And so the eschatological vision is bodily, it's creational, but it's also one that should help, could and should be a resource for Christians and religious communities to think about what this world should look like, how we should be projecting out, and it's one that's in deep tension with the kind of secular eschatology we have of the American dream.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you tell me about your relationship with Kierkegaard? He shows up in both books. And then, because here's the thing. No one that reads Kierkegaard has a mild feeling about him. Like he either becomes this person, you're like, I can't believe everyone's supposed to read this, right? Or he impacts you and you wrestle with him the rest of your life, all that kind of stuff. So what role did he play in kind of your own particular interpretation or engagement with radical theology?
Yeah, I love Kierkegaard. And he really is kind of, I guess, fundamental for me. Maybe not the word to use for radical theology, but so for me, the kind of the central push of Kierkegaard is about that tension between Christianity and Christendom. And so some of what Kierkegaard did for me, just personally in my own intellectual history, is that sense in which Kierkegaard, lived in this context in which what was called Christianity was something that was deeply identified with the European empire at his time. This cultural fabric of wealth and power and learning. And he saw that, and then he read the Gospels, and he was perplexed and deeply troubled. And that's something that I kind of saw in Kierkegaard, and was a bit of a kind of a crystalline vision and a powerful awakening to see that tension, that what we think has been called the faith, what we think Christianity is, what we've been even taught about the path of Jesus Christ, is maybe not quite what we will find in the Gospels, but actually deeply in tension with it. And then on top of that, Kierkegaard has this complicated pedagogy that he's trying to undertake in his books, at least as I read him, where he's not just telling people, it's not a pedagogy for the ignorant, right? It's not a pedagogy that says, here's a new piece of knowledge. You never knew this. It's a pedagogy for people who think they already have it figured out. They think they already know who Jesus is. They think they already know what theology is and what the church is. And he has this complicated pedagogy of doing this kind of therapy to begin to put all those faculties in check, to open up space for the path of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he writes in pseudonyms and all sorts of ways of getting people. So it takes up a pseudonym. So he writes like the person he's wanting to disturb, right? Like he occupies their space. And I wonder how you see that in relationship to largely Protestantism in America, because there's a sense that Kierkegaard was invested in failing to evangelize, right? Like he wanted to raise the bar, that if you were going to attempt to use the word Christian or say you're a member of the church or that you have faith, then he wanted to raise the bar so high you never got over it, but you wouldn't be able to quit trying, right? Like this, and his criticisms towards culture in Christendom is one where, your participation in the church and your identity as a Christian was part and parcel your identity as a citizen and part of just, the bourgeois culture, dominant leaders and all that kind of stuff. And it was problematic. And because I find him interesting. And partially, I think he's been underutilized by a lot of radical theologians because, he was more interested in attacking the concept or the construct of the faithful Christian than he was attacking the church. Because the church, even if it wasn't very faithful and didn't think it was stuck with text and rituals that if you just paid attention to them could ruin you. Right. And so that like subjective nature of faith and the demand and, that kind of thing is it can be radical, and it's precisely by insisting the confessional tradition has more going on within it than it knows.
Right. And yeah, so it's radical in that sense of getting back to the roots in a certain way. And especially trying to get back there by doing some of that work of weeding out the kind of structures that have been placed on top of them. And I actually I agree that I think that Kierkegaard is really underutilized, and I think that it's for me his fundamental contribution. I'm saying that word again, fundamental, is maybe I'm revealing something here. Is that shift from what to how, right? And I think that what the how that Kierkegaard has to bring to us is to really take the forms and genres and ways of writing more seriously. And this is a line I kind of end Exercise in New Creation with, taken from Mark Jordan, that says that, there's been this kind of revolution in thinking about writing and language in all kinds of disciplines and in all kinds of crafts, right? But in theology, we have said all kinds of radical things about language in mainstream theology, but in the kind of given academic forms of the research university. And I think one of the real lessons from Kierkegaard is the way that he plays with writing, the way that he plays with form, and not just to communicate then a content, but to carry out, to sometimes even to frustrate the reader. Like my reading of like Fear and Trembling, which is maybe the most text that most people are familiar with Kierkegaard, I think it's actually been misread. I think a lot of what Kierkegaard is doing is he's trying to frustrate the professors who have now excerpted Fear and Trembling and say that it's, here's the theory of Fear and Trembling. Whereas I think a lot of Fear and Trembling is about trying to inspire a sense of fear and trembling by trying to make faith into a system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. There is a the depth of affect in reading Kierkegaard is a lot higher than most theologians. But honestly, a lot of theologians are jealous of syllogisms, and that might be part of the problem. The Whitehead has this line where he said, for such a mysterious and beautiful concept, it's really depressing how many religious leaders can't tell a joke. And and he's like, well, I would never trust religious leaders that can't tell jokes. And I think it's getting at something similar. There's so, what strikes me in thinking about, your observation about writing is that partially why the Green Good News is, it takes the form and shape it does. Like, it's not your typical, theology text.
Right. Well, yeah. So it's written for, part of that is just, it's written for a different audience. But part of that is also kind of, as with any writer, right, the books that you write end up doing work on you. And so the first book I wrote was saying that trying to reorient philosophical theology toward the exercise of care of the self, the city, and creation, try and put it in this space of everyday life. And by saying that, putting in the space of everyday life, I don't want to say then that kind of things have to be made crystal clear in the categories as they are. I think that there is something, there is kind of a tyranny of the practical that I think theology needs to continue to fight against. But there also was a sense in which I wanted to try and do writing that engaged a wider audience, and not just a wider audience in terms of numbers, but to engage people, to engage an audience of clergy and church people and activists, and to try and foster a conversation across those lines with scholarship. And so, so the Green Good News is written both in a way where a lot of the scholarly debates are even just bracketed. And then a lot of the writing is about trying to interrogate the way that power hides in plain sight in everyday life, and then to engage in an exegesis that is not so much about connecting every point of what's been said in biblical studies and theology for the last 10 years, but to try and unfold a positive ecological and justice-centered vision.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that shows up in it, and in a sense, I feel like it's, using Jesus to point out the way he does his teaching is parabolic, the materiality and the community element at the heart of his healing ministry, the attentiveness to the role of our consumption and food and gathering spaces, and a relationship to the unspoken but all rehearsed hierarchies, and even, reworking the notions of prayer and things. I feel like there's a lot of times when you read, if you are the type that likes reading books about the impending ecological crisis, they either are ones that capture and explain well, right? Like the situation you're in, such that you're like, good, now I can finally convince my so-and-so family member, who obviously I'm never going to convince, or it's reinforcing to you that we are as screwed as you think in your head. Or it's like the enlightened liberal who's like, yeah, but technology is going to fix it, and that kind of thing. But very rarely is it a book that goes, what would it mean to have a community whose very character and way of being is simultaneously informed and resisting, but also your well-being will be higher, right? Like that's the thing I think about the book that I like the best, is that you don't get to the end of it and go, oh, do I need to, I guess I just have to go do this now. Feel guilted into whatever. Like you're using Jesus and his ministry to say, like, actually, if we lived in a more sustainable way and harness the power of genuine, redemptive, and liberating communities, then your own life would be richer, right? It's so much better than Debbie Downer versions of ecological response, which are bad cognitive. If you want to change someone's mind, don't do it that way. For someone that insists on science being right, you have not read cognitive science of persuasion, because like going, Jeremiads on everyone is how you keep the person that disagrees with you stuck in their position. But anyway, so yeah. Tell me about that. Cause I like the book, and I've already recommended it to a couple friends.
Well, thank you. I guess, I've been engaged in kind of work of climate justice and just being kind of a liberal, really leftist person who's freaking out about it for a long time. And for a while was doing exactly the kind of pedagogy you described, where just dealing with the coming cataclysm, and trying to argue with people about that. But actually, I think that exactly like you said, that work is not the work. Our work is not to argue with individuals. Our work is to create spaces that we can invite people into, right? So then it's not about a debate. And to create those spaces so as to come to see a different way of life, and then from that build collective power, network with other networks, build collective power, change systems. And that kind of shift for me happened in two places. One is with kind of food justice initiatives and the Christian food movement. It's been really transformative for me to be involved in those kind of local efforts where something that's just and something that's joyful kind of shake hands. And exactly like you said, where something that actually turns out it's good for my family to take care of the place where we are and to take care of the earth where we are, and that there's some nurturing that comes from that. But I also saw a resonance of that. I mean, that's also the gospel, right? That it's only by losing our lives that we can save them. And to see that with green eyes, or to see it even just with the eyes of a people shaped by covenant. Mm-hmm. Right. And the covenant is always, I think, between God, neighbor, and land. The land is always there. Is that it's only by losing our imperial lives that we can save our lives for the kingdom. It's only by losing our lives of consumerism, destruction, neoliberal judgment on ourselves and everyone else, that we can save our lives of, basic familial, communal, creaturely relationships.
Yeah. So one of my favorite passages in the book is on 164. I'll dramatically read it, but it has this image. You talk about Jesus and the exit strategy for Pharisees. You say, Jesus is laying out a certain exit strategy for the Pharisees, showing them a way to sneak out the back door of the imperial banquet. He is seeking to topple hierarchies and to change structures. Christ in no uncertain term pronounces judgments and woe upon those who will not change their ways. But at the heart of all this is a vision of joy and blessing. Even in the meal at the leader of the Pharisees' house, after Christ gives advice to sit at the lowest position and to organize meals for the people of the Jubilee, a member of the gathering is able to see that it carries hope of a new life and world. One of the dinner guests pronounces a beatitude. Blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. To be released from the games of status and competition is to be restored into joy, solidarity, justice, love, and hope. That image of creating an exit strategy so he can sneak out the back door of the imperial banquet. And you can say more about it. I know I see a lot of my friends who end up in theological education or get connected, through like things like the podcast, books and stuff, discover the one they've called the Christ was way more hardcore than they ever imagined. And it's good because now they actually have something. Jesus becomes the tool by which you deconstruct religion and nation and economy and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of those individuals then get, too captured by the ability to critique that they aren't able to go to a banquet at the person you can't stand house. And simultaneously, right? It's not like Jesus didn't say what he believed, but he said it in a room where he was still invited. Like the way he showed up to the one he said woe to, they still thought you should hang out with him at dinner. And so he was clear, but stayed connected. And in doing that and not like getting so anxious that he had to win the argument or whatever, he held open the back door to leave the imperial banquet. And I think one of the biggest challenges for progressive Christians is figuring out how to go to the banquets of those that need someone to be clear about what we need to do and the challenges that face us, but also to just show up and not have that difference determine everything and hold open the door for those to find a new space. Because the observation you have that he's stuck, in this game of status and competition. Like when you're someone who's stuck in that role, which is the piety of neoliberal capitalism, right? And then like have some mercy on them in a sense, right? Like recognize just because some of us have realized something and moved to a new place, it doesn't, one, we're still probably riddled with it. And two, you don't have a situation where the difference in your positions doesn't ultimately free you from the responsibility to engage your neighbor.
Yeah, I do. I mean, and that's a tension that I feel pretty deeply in my own life. And I mean, I think you named it really well, because part of it is it's hard to be in those spaces because I've been shaped by that culture so deeply.
Right.
And I'm still so gripped by just that game of status and competition, even though I'm not really even functionally in it anymore. And just in terms of, I'm not on some kind of fast track to success, but still it's in my heart. And so being in those spaces is oftentimes difficult because I don't want to acknowledge, well, one, I don't want to acknowledge how much that still is shaping me. And two, there's just so much of me that just wants to jump into that. But I think you're right that, this has been one of the things I've been struggling with in my ministry in the last several years has been realizing that a lot of the work I need to be doing, right? So and this even happened in a few years ago. This even happened in a kind of a way which I realized the neighborhood I need to be working in is not the low income neighborhood, right? I need to be connected to people in that neighborhood enough to where a lot of my kind of broken intuitions are kept in check. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the spaces that I have access to and need to exercise my voice in are those spaces of privilege and power where everyone's thinking about success and competition and where it's very uncomfortable for me to be in. And so I think that a lot of the work is going into those spaces and then also speaking a truth, like you said, that's maybe not, that's not about me protecting my righteousness against them, but maybe speaking a truth that is also an invitation. But that's hard because, again, my heart's been shaped by this culture. And at least in the context I live in, there are a lot of very powerful norms that police situations that try to get people to stop from saying stuff that's true. Right? So like I think about like being in like I've been trying to phase them out, but I've served on a lot of boards and there's really strong social norms, even on like a church board or a nonprofit board, about what we can talk about and how we can talk about it. And mm-hmm. when you start talking about justice issues, sometimes in those contexts, there's all kinds of strong norms that people try and personalize it to you. It's like, this is your thing. Why did you do this? Why did you come make a mess? So I think that there's all kinds of difficulties with being that witness, right? Because I'm not Christ. There's all kinds of difficulties with being that witness in that space, with people who are even less awake than me, even though I'm barely awake. But I think that's a lot of the work that we have to do. And I think that the other side of that, and I think this is a lot of what you were getting at too, is I can do that more. I can be in those spaces more effectively and be in those spaces more truthfully and be in those spaces more vulnerably and more as a human when I also have other communities that I'm grounded in and that I feel like I'm connected to. And I think that's also one of the problems with progressive politics, is just how individualistic it is and how poorly progressives do community oftentimes.
Oh yeah. Yeah. They, and I know it because of just the feedback I get from people that, listen to the podcast. There's so many ministers who experience, the expectations you were talking about that in a board, but they experience it just in the sense of, they end up at a congregation, you go in, and then you real quickly learn, that underneath the actual job description was, written in invisible ink, is this expectation that, we called you here because you obviously were ordained and gifted, but we actually don't want you to be yourself. And right. we don't want to change that much. So if you could not talk about most of what you're passionate about, that would be excellent. And so when, especially for ministers, you get in that situation and the people they're asking are literally the ones that, can vote and decide whether or not you have health insurance. So that impacts it. But I mean, there are also people who I know that wish there was any community that was clear about their larger convictions about the world and the nature of community and its vocation in dealing with a number of the global crises and such. And so they have to find community online because the only progressive churches they went to are just ranting about identity politics things. And but in their day-to-day life, there's very little different type of impact they're making than the people they're complaining about, right? The same state's probably going to vote the same way in the election. You can make little itty bitty difference. They're all going to pay taxes that goes to the exact same things. What's the big difference? And sometimes you don't even know what the answer is supposed to be. You just know that what you're doing can't be counted as good. Right. And so sometimes the beginning of change is just updating that prayer of confession to include more.
Yeah, I mean, I live in Kentucky, it's a place both where politics are depressing, and we're also kind of the default culture, not the default, but kind of the majority culture it's very conservative. I mean, this is Trump land, and so that even means that profoundly shapes even how progressives understand themselves and what's possible in the world. And yeah, so being a pastor in that context is incredibly difficult. And so I guess in my life, I go to a church and then I have a dinner church at my house. Some of the plays I'm finding that kind of community, those are small enclaves. And it's the fruit of that. And so doing work in a place like this, I think you really have to think on a long timeline. But that's it. But that's just the work of the kingdom, and that's the work of social change, right? So we're like, the saying is like, if you want to be involved with taking on the most powerful system in the world that, has centuries of legacy and trauma it's left behind, to play that game, just to sit at that table, the chips are decades of your life. And it's just how it is, right? And when you think about climate change, that gets terrifying because there's all this urgency. But I think we have to be thinking on a number of timelines, and we do have to get everything we can get done in the next decade. But if ultimately, the problem of climate change is rooted in these structural problems, it's going to take a long time for those structures to be transformed, to be more just, and to be more beautiful. And so a lot of that is doing patient work. And so to do that patient work, though, again, that's again another reason why you need the resources of community, and you need the resources of Scripture, and you need all the spiritual disciplines you can get, and not spiritual disciplines for self-care because you should be white-knuckling it and figuring it out, but because you need these communal disciplines to keep you alive and to keep you to keep the Spirit in you while you do this work. But because that kind of work of change, because I think there still can be, so even for that pastor in that conservative congregation that, where there was kind of a bait and switch that happened, I think that's important work, and doing work to bring people along over decades is important. But you need to find way, I think, that to do that and not just be resigned and to not just become a chaplain of empire, there have to be all kinds of other networks that you plug into so that you can kind of stay centered as much as you can, and see that, decade after decade will make a difference, because prophetic patience is different from kind of like centrist pragmatism, right? Prophetic patience is not just working within the system as it is. It's realizing that these are deeply rooted problems, and it's going to take time, but I'm going to keep pushing.
And some of the prophets were, pragmatic enough to know you just gonna have to wait till certain groups did, right? Like, and so part of their vocation was casting a different vision of what fidelity to the covenant and community looks like. But it wasn't like they were sitting there going, well, it immediately is going to happen. But by casting the vision, and, so maybe if we actually had, universal health care, it would postpone genuine transformation, because The life extension would. Just to be clear, I was being sarcastic. Anyway, I do think that the patience takes different things, and also there is a real rhythm of generational progress, right? Like that. And I've said something like this before, where if you think back 3 generations in all of our families, it's like who you are and where you were and what was happening is not where you are now. But you could usually, if you take that scale, see the differences that are happening. Like, what are the changes in your family over that time that are worth celebrating, and which ones are worth addressing? And you can even love your family generations back and be embarrassed by decisions they made and all that kind of stuff. And hopefully, if you don't suck at parenting, your grandkids will look at you and be like, man, I can't believe you did that. And it just is so obvious to them that there's a deeper reservoir of community and justice and things that they just think has to be the case. And you're like, what are you talking about? Whoa, I've changed enough. And then God's like, that's why you probably should die soon.
Right.
But I mean, I was saying it jokingly, but I do think it's, sometimes when people get the vision for the first time, they get the idea, they expect everyone just to go along with it when the first time they hear it. And that didn't happen. Jesus was so clear. He preached his congregation down to 3 women who showed up at the cross. So,
right. Well, and we have all these images of like speaking truth to power, which I think sometimes happens with a microphone in front of your face, but I think it's mostly like around a table or at a deathbed, or, you know, that kind of prophetic work. I mean, Jesus is doing that prophetic work in all kinds of pastoral contexts and in all kinds of organizing of communities. And it's not just yelling it into a microphone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of the greatest gifts you give as a leader for these type of things is permission and support, right? Like a lot of times I think ministers feel obligated to be the one leading, but, you know, if you figure out how to give permission and give support, then difference can be made in a different way. Like one, and I think I've said it on the podcast before, but, you know, after the Parkland shooting, David Hogg was one of my youth in Los Angeles before his family moved to Florida. And so then all of a sudden, all the old youth group members are like, oh, Junk, you know, that's someone we know and they're all texting and we're trying to get a hold of mom to see if he's okay and all that kind of stuff. And I remember after one of the other youth messaged me and like, David went on TV talking about gun rights or something, you know? And I'm like, whatever. No one's going to like, I just immediately just assume like, well, what good's going to come from some kid saying thing, right? And then like a month later, he's at the National Mall and there are hundreds, thousands of people listening, and you've made progress in little areas over, and then he's helped organize people to vote. And I'm like, never mind, Tripp. I don't know what you're thinking. Everything he's done is stuff I would have supported, complained could never happen. And then, you know, someone you know just decides like, well, why can't it? Why can't it? And I'm like, man, I've already gotten old. I'm already old. I immediately said, yeah, you're in Florida, dude. Whoa. Yeah. Do you know how them rednecks work? Like immediately it was just like, this is not happening. And then, you know, I get a message like, now you're going to the rally, right? I'm like, yeah, I'm going to go. And, but then I think I'm sitting there at the rally and they, you know, showing all the, speeches stuff. He's up there and my son is 11 then, and he sees him and he's like, I played hide and go seek with him at church. And you can do this if you want to. And now like Elgin just has this idea that like at some point you get an opportunity and you can go make a real difference. And he just thinks it should be obvious that you get to. So, like those experiences to me made me go, realize how much power there is in permission and support. And, you know, you don't even have to be the one that does it so much when you're in leadership. If you can help them encounter and catch a vision and stuff like, you don't always have to be the one holding the microphone.
It's so important to keep that kind of imagination alive of, you know, of thinking what's possible, like having that open and also keeping the faith that actually it is better for people to live in loving community rather than to have a ton of money, right? If we have that choice, but I think, because I think ingrained in my kind of moral imaginary and in my heart, I do sometimes wonder, are they right? Is that the way really to security and sustenance and success is to follow that? So I think one of the things is to keep that imagination and that faith in the kingdom alive. But I think like what you were saying that's also helpful is to not just think that that's going to come from you and you have to do that on your own, right? You just have to have the eyes to see, that other people are bearing that light to you all the time.
Mm-hmm. I had a Dmin student that was, came in wanting to basically introduce to his very normal Presbyterian church, but it's PCUSA, it's like the liberal mainline version, earth care stuff, right? And he had gotten involved in all the local things and is trying to, brings it up when it makes sense at sermons and trying to make it in the liturgy and all this kind of stuff. And he had tried, I don't know how many different things, where basically like the same three people came to each attempt to endeavor. And then he had one of the older men in the congregation who normally complained about his sermons came to him and said, well, we're going to need a move. We're going to need to move the spring fishing trip up a week. Otherwise, the bass aren't going to be on their beds and the kids won't get a bunch of fish. And he was like, why? He's like, oh, they're bedding earlier. Why? Well, the water's warmer. And and the fisherman's like explaining to him, basically the effects of climate change. And he's like, this guy is a Trump Christian. There's nothing about this. He's sitting there explaining it to him. And he goes, yeah. He goes, and how's that dealing with overall health? The fisherman sitting there explaining the lake and all these things because he just pays attention and is there all the time. And he's like, yeah, I'm really worried about it. I mean, somebody's got to do something. And he goes, what kind of things can we do? Maybe we can let people know about this or there. And he goes in and just says, there's only 3 or 4 people ever can clean up the place. And then people, he goes on and he goes, what we really need is just a group of people that, they do the streets. They decide this is our lake. All the water and everything comes from there. Somebody should be taking care of it and making sure people in the city know what's going on. And he's like, well, maybe the church could adopt it. And he goes, you're allowed to do that. See, by the time, he sits there and it's this whole project shifts because this guy, if he had said climate change, guys, I have no money. No, he's not handling any of this. He's like, well, there were dinosaurs, so things change. But the guy's passion, his attentiveness to it, and then it turns in. Now you have people who voted against each other showing up at city council meeting, advocating for the health of the lake and all kinds of stuff. So I just remember thinking, he wanted to be the one. I'm going to do this. And the next thing you know, it's the person he thought he was preaching at that. He let him take the lead in things. And the next thing you know, he's got big groups showing up. They're involved. And it's the first time that church had ever actually shown up at city council meetings or presented and that kind of thing. And, and I think that reminds me of that line, in your book where you talk about, holding the door open, right? Because if he was clear as he could be throughout, sermon and stuff, he just got eye rolls. But the moment he heard something stirring in the other person, then he went with that and blessed it and encouraged it and gave him permission.
Well, and part of what I think is really helpful about talking about problems in terms of structure systems, and then with the biblical metaphor, or not the structures of empire, is that it changes climate change. From the causes of climate change are carbon emissions. But where does that come from? Right. Well, it comes from all these economic and political structures and technologies. And those are set up in such a way that, infinite growth, exploitation, all that. Those are set up in such a way that's where all these carbon emissions are coming from. Right. So, and so I think going to that place of empire gets us into different problems, so that climate change isn't just about carbon emissions, but so like Jesus goes to the problems of brokenness and says, a lot of people have debt. There is this crushing debt that is destroying our communities. Right. That's at the root of the problem. And I think that I guess the pastoral situation you were just describing is similar, where instead of starting with, kind of the component causes of carbon emissions, you maybe go to another place where people are feeling the brokenness of structures, right? And so that could be, where they experience it and bring it to you, or it could also be naming, the ways that empire is breaking down, that's destroying community in ways that people feel, in ways that they feel in their homes, they feel in their broken relationships. And so seeing that kind of those root sources and those root causes, and address, so Jesus addresses those in oftentimes pastoral ways. That's one of the ways to hold the door open, and to also see it as encompassing the entire work of the kingdom, instead of like a special committee that can then talk about light bulbs and washing dishes.
Yeah. I think that's really good. So, last question is, what is the question you're working on now? Right. Like, so if these books kind of come out of that, going through graduate school, and your primary conversation partners and such are professional nerds, now that you're getting to spend time, with a community of community leaders, right, through being in theological education, is there a particular question or book or thing that's a research project on the horizon that comes out of that type of contact?
Yeah. So the long-term project, I think, is on thinking about transforming the suburbs. Right. So if the suburbs are the kind of geography and actual place of whiteness, of accumulation and consumption, and also they're kind of the place that we are stuck with in a lot of ways. It's a lot of our geography, right? We can't just level all of our cities and then rebuild, eco cities. There's that would be the biggest carbon footprint we could imagine. So these are the spaces we're left with. These are the spaces that a lot of people live in. That's kind of my context. So the next work is thinking about, how do we transform the suburbs? And so then how can Christian social imaginaries, Christian spiritual disciplines, and Christian forms of community and Christian food movement, how can those be agents of change to repurpose and to transform the suburbs? That's kind of a longer term project. In the short term, I think what I'm working on is a couple of books on the Psalms. So right now I'm working on a book on the Psalms and kind of love and loss and dementia. So I'm kind of going in a little bit of a different direction with that. So, but looking at the Psalms as a way in which we can find an expression for suffering and loss and death that's so often muted in our culture. And so the Psalms can help us give voice to that, but then also frame that in joyful ways. And so that was actually is a more pastoral book. It's reflections on the Psalms and then reflections on my dad's decade with dementia. And then my idea is to write a companion piece. That one's singing the Psalms with my father. The next piece would be singing the Psalms with my son. And also, so then looking at the Psalms also as thinking about issues of parenting in the face of climate change.
Oh, man. Yeah. You can figure that one out. I was overhearing my son and cousins talking, and they were debating whether or not they wanted to have children.
Yeah.
And my son was like, I really do, because unless dad's faking it, it's probably the best, most exciting thing he's ever done. And I just really, really want to do that, but I just don't know if it's fair to my kid. And I'm like, that's kind of about as sad as it gets. And I don't know. I don't know what because kids are developed not at the same pace cognitively and emotionally, a lot of times they can understand things intellectually. They don't have the tools to process emotionally. And then, there's bound to be some framework for doing it. All I know is I don't think we should handle it like evangelicals handled the eschaton in the 90s, right? Like we don't need to make turn into Left Behind for ecocide or something,
right? Well, but I mean that dynamic you described is so heartbreaking. But that's what it's like to be a parent now, and that's one of the reasons also why I want to turn to the Psalms is that space of lament and penance and kind of anger at the wicked, but then also these kind of imaginations of hope, of a world redeemed, of people. Some of the Psalms even are people who are in exile, have no way, and having hope for a way.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, I hope when any of it comes out, let me know so we can hang out again on the internet. And who knows? They might do another Subverting the Norm conference, and then we can rally the troops. You should do it in Kentucky.
People of Lexington, yeah. It was. Well, I really appreciate you having me on your trip. I love the show. Long time listener, first time caller. It's good to be on here.
Awesome, cool. Well, I hope you have a good morning over in the other side of the planet.